Hello everyone, welcome to my Callisto protocol, maximum security difficulty, no upgrades walkthrough. This will cover the beginning all the way to the part where we get the suit. You might be wondering why I've included this introduction, because I normally trim out these kind of moments since there's no gameplay or anything I need to discuss. Well, I do need to discuss something. It's with how shit this entire introduction is. And considering that this is made by the same team that handled Dead Space 2, what the hell were they thinking with this introduction? Even in my blind playthrough, I was so burned out by this introduction. And I did not understand the whole point of it, and there were just so many moments where the voice acting was very strange. There was no gameplay whatsoever. This could have easily been a skippable introduction, but Visceral Games / Striking Distance Studios in this case, they have this habit of not making any of their games have skippable cutscenes, and I don't understand why. This is utilizing next-generation technology, although I think they released this game on the previous generation as well, so the PS4 and the Xbox One, and I don't know why they did that. I mean, I understand that you're trying to release this game to a wider audience, but the problem is a lot of the techniques that the developers use to hide loading screens because of the inferior hardware provided by the PS4 and the Xbox One, whether it be through unskippable cutscenes, doors that just require a very long animation to actually play out, stuff like that. All of that gets translated into the next generation version of the game. So all of those moments where the developers are trying to use animations to hide loading screens get translated into the PS5 / Xbox Series X version of the game. And to relate to this introduction, all you're doing in this introduction is you're just being introduced to shimmying, you're crouching, you're just going through all this unskippable gameplay right here, which should have been a cutscene. There's all this exposition playing out, and there's no interesting set pieces playing. It's so boring. And the fact that you're going to have to replay this every single time you want to play this game, as well as any other moment where you're just shimmying between pipes, or you're shimmying into narrow spaces, or you're just going through these exposition moments. And what the fuck is the whole point of this sequence right here? Why did they make this gameplay? All I'm doing is holding up on the left analog stick, and I'm just watching Jacob climb up the floor right over here, just so he can get into the pilot seat. Why is this not a cutscene I can skip? Why do you make this gameplay? And like I said, these moments where they're trying to hide the loading screens on the previous versions of the game are going to translate into the next generation versions of the game, which is the PS5 and the Xbox Series X versions. And Dead Space 2's introduction was nothing like this. They at least made their gameplay interesting for an introduction when they're introducing the story. But that was not the case right here. And that right there is a terrible way to introduce your game. And the Callisto Protocol is sadly a 3 out of 10 based on my ranking, because while this game did have some charm to it, there were mostly negative moments and lost potential displayed with this game. And also moments where the mechanics just betray you. And we've now skipped on ahead to the prison area, and I know that there is an encounter with the first infected, and you have to go through a cinematic tutorial where it's introducing you to dodging, and you gain access to the pipe, and then you kill that enemy. I skipped down on it because I did not create a manual save before that point, because I didn't want to waste time with it, because the manual save I was making for that sequence was when I wanted to come back to this game and just replay it. And I did not want to sit through that introduction again to just get to that part where I'm dealing with the first enemy. And plus, the melee on this game is pretty simple to handle at the moment, and so that's why I've just skipped on ahead to this part. But the melee on this game. The melee is a huge point of contention with a lot of the reviews of this game, and it's not so bad. I mean, it's pretty simple, but there are a couple things you need to know. The first thing is with dodging. Now, dodging on this game is another point of contention that the critics lambasted the game for, because of its very unusual and unorthodox control scheme, but it's not that bad. The tutorial mentions that you hold the left analog stick either to the left or to the right, and there's no timing window, and you have to alternate between left and right when you're dodging a series of attacks. So basically the way you think of it is, when the game detects you strafing, it will then initiate a dodge and then need to strafe in the other direction in order to initiate another dodge to block the second or third hit of a combo. And for the most part, the enemies will mainly do 2-hit combos up until a later point in the game where they will gain access to 3-hit combos. And when the enemies mutate on this game, they will mainly do 3-hit combos. The only real exception to this 2-hit, 3-hit combo rule for the enemies is with Captain Ferris, because Captain Ferris can do like 5 to 6-hit combos. And I have to talk about Captain Ferris right here because Captain Ferris is the most broken boss in this game because there is a huge bug with the performance mode, and I asked Ether this, and he mentioned that it's likely attributed to the performance mode. But for some reason, when you're dodging Captain Ferris, 100% of the time, Captain Ferris just hits you, and the dodge doesn't register. And Ether has mentioned to me that this has to do with the performance mode, because apparently they rendered the attack animations of Captain Ferris with 30 frames per second in mind, and because on the performance mode, you can play above 30 frames per second, that's why you get moments where you're dodging Ferris, and randomly your dodge just doesn't register. Ooh, and also right here, this crate, you'll want to make sure you have auto QTE on, because this game has the worst grab animations I have ever seen in a game by far, because there is no reacting to the grab animations that the enemies do. The enemies just randomly, they choose to initiate a grab animation against you. You cannot move, you cannot dodge it, you have no possible way of reacting to it. They just do it whenever they want to. And if you don't have auto QTE on, you're going to take damage every single time when it comes to a grab animation. If you have auto QTE on, you will negate all grab damage, and that is good. But at the same time, it highlights just how incompetent the developers were when designing the attack animations for this game, specifically with the grab animations. And I have no idea why they would design the grabs in such a way that it completely invalidates the melee and dodge system, but that is completely fucking retarded. That is worse than anything that new Capcom could have possibly done with Resident Evil Village or with some of the games they developed. On that part right there, just run past the enemies. Dealing with multiple enemies in the melee combat is so fucking stupid, clunky, and cumbersome that you need to make sure that you are getting into as few situations as possible where you are dealing with multiple enemies in the melee combat. The melee on this game is designed for one-on-one encounters. It is not designed for handling multiple enemies. And you have to be facing the enemy in order for the dodge to register where you're actually strafing. If you're not facing the enemy, Jacob never dodges. And also, when you're in the melee combat, Jacob will do these combos where on the final hit of his combo, he will knock the enemy away from him. And if you end up being close to a wall and you do that knockback animation, the enemy will most likely be knocked at a weird angle in relation to you. And so you're going to have to rely upon aiming in order to cancel the recovery frames of the melee so that you can then reposition yourself in order to actually continue doing the melee. Oh, and this part right here, this is a stupidly designed section. I don't know what the developers were expecting you to do, but you have to stealth kill that guy, and then you need to alert the guy right in front of you because an enemy spawns right behind you. And this is something that this game does a lot, and it's something that the reviews lambasted to no end. Enemies spawning behind you. Enemy spawning behind you is such a dumb way to encourage difficulty, and it just forces you to just take it nice and slowly, this and that, and slow the gameplay down, and you're having to memorize the spawns a lot. You have to have a lot of premature knowledge of how the spawns work in order for the sequences to work better. And there are a lot of moments in this game where the gameplay isn't suited for a first playthrough, and you'll be restarting a lot just to understand how certain sequences work and how certain pieces of scripting work in order to actually do the sections properly. And that part I restarted so many times in my blind playthrough because it was so badly designed. And this right here will be able to gain access to the hand cannon. And this contraband pack that I have right here, this comes when you purchase the day one version of the game. And I'm just going to drop it right here. I'm not going to sell it because I don't want to get a cheap advantage over other players. And for the most part, I'm going to try my in this entire walkthrough, but like I said, this is not a no damage walkthrough. This is a no upgrades walkthrough because there are so many moments in this game where it is unclear if you've taken damage or not, and then there are a lot of moments where you're dealing with maggots or you're dealing with enemies in situations where you're going to be taking mandatory damage a lot, that it's just not worth doing a no damage restriction for this game. And also, with regards to the final boss is another reason why I don't waste time doing a no damage walkthrough, because that has to be one of the worst final bosses I have ever seen in a game. And it is objectively flawed in so many ways because the gameplay, it becomes so fucking awkward just having to maneuver around the boss, trying to pick up ammunition and health, trying to deal with those stupid exploders that spawn in. Like, it just becomes a mess, and then the boss has access to a acid ability that you cannot dodge whatsoever. You can block it, but unfortunately, you take damage when you block in this game. I have no idea why developers do this, where they design a block system that you're going to be taking damage when you use it, just like in Resident Evil Village. I mean, there were certain attacks in Resident Evil Village that you could block and not take any damage, but for the most part, the block was entirely useless in Resident Evil Village. And I don't know how the developers think of their fans, but do they really want to make a system that encourages bad play, where you're just going to be blocking attacks and taking so much damage in the process that you're just going to be spamming healing items like crazy? Like, what kind of skillful play does that encourage? I don't understand. I don't know what they were thinking with that. And this game sadly has a block system that deals damage to you, and the worst part is that in the upgrade system, they have melee upgrades specific to blocking, so you have to block in order to do very specific attacks in the upgrade system, and it's so stupid. So I'm not going to be blocking whatsoever, aside from a couple of moments involving maggots and against the final boss, because the maggots, they do very little damage to you, so it really doesn't make any difference whatsoever. I'm not going to complain about it. I know Serum17 will complain about it to no end, because he's the kind of guy that likes to criticize things that go against his pride as a no-damage player, rather than actually poor designs. And going back to my tangent, aside from the maggots, I will also be using the block against the acid attack, just out of the blue. I just do it out of reaction more than anything with that final boss fight. Like, that boss is terrible. And look at that just then. Do you see how bullshit that grab was? The guy canceled his rising animation in order to grab me. There is no possible way for me to avoid that. There is no possible way for me to dodge that. How is that fair? How is that good? And if I didn't have Auto QTE on, I'd be taking damage. And the enemies do so much damage to you when you get grabbed on this game. It's so bullshit. Not even the Resident Evil series could stoop that low when it comes to designing grab attacks like that. Even though, like, the grabs in the older Resident Evil games are always very bullshit with how they were designed, and with how the grabs could easily take advantage of the limited capabilities provided by your character. But they were never as bullshit as that. I mean, that guy did it randomly out of nowhere, and I had no chance of avoiding it. It's so bullshit. So always make sure you have Auto QTE on, because the grabs on this game are bullshit. And also right here, we'll be gaining access to a device known as the grip. And the grip on this game is basically kinesis from Dead Space, but you have the ability to grab enemies when they're alive. And also, compared to kinesis, the grip has an energy bar, so there is a limit to how much you can use it, and you need to replenish your grip by either restarting the checkpoint or by using a battery. And I like the fact that you can restart the checkpoint to replenish your grip, because this game does have a passive recharge system for the grip, and it takes like 2 to 3 minutes for the grip to fully recharge. And I cannot imagine anyone sitting in an area for 2 to 3 minutes just waiting for something like a grip to regenerate. And the whole idea of restarting the checkpoint is parallel to the very idea of waiting 2 to 3 minutes for your grip to recharge with no risk whatsoever, but you're just getting an instant recharge and just restarting the checkpoint. That is perfectly fine, and I have no idea if Dead Space had a similar system, because I know stasis in Dead Space could recharge on its own volition. So did restarting the checkpoint actually replenish your stasis in Dead Space 1, 2, and 3? I have no idea. I mean, I do know you get stasis modules, and on this game, you have to use the batteries from the inventory, or what you can do is when your energy bar has a square or a rectangle on it, you can use your grip again, and it will just instantly replenish, but it will consume a battery. So you will automatically use batteries if you re-engage your grip when it's out of energy. And also, this combat sequence right here, I think this is a really dumb way to introduce the grip. I mean, those 2 enemies I can understand, but for some reason, when you pick up this gate fuse, 3 more enemies spawn in. And this is where I'm going to showcase something really fun that you can do with the grip. And this is really where the gameplay can get very interesting and very fun and creative. So, this game has death barriers for the enemies. So basically, the death barriers on this game, they are pieces of geometry that the player is not able to climb on or stand on, or they are parts of an area that you are not allowed to be in. And when you put enemies on these death barriers, they will instantly die, and that is where the grip can be a really fun tool to use, and it really makes this game very enjoyable. I mean, it's probably not intentional, but I like to think it is intentional, because, like, remember at Dead Space 3, that infinite item glitch, and how EA said that glitch was actually intentional? What do you bet that this whole death barrier system is actually intentional, and this was just the developer's way of rewarding the player for investment in their game? And, like, I discovered this during the Habitat area, and then I ended up discovering this on accident near the finale of the game in one of my other playthroughs. And it is so much fun to use the grip this way, and not only that, it helps balance out any poorly designed sequence, because why the fuck would you put 5 enemies in a room after you just got the grip, and you're in the middle of getting acquainted with the gameplay when it's your first playthrough? I don't understand that. And you have to deal with that on repeat playthroughs, and using the death barriers to your advantage balances out certain parts of the gameplay. Like, if the gameplay is going to fuck you, then you need to fuck a poor design by using a very fun, unintended side effect to a mechanic to your advantage. Well, I've just skipped out on the moment where Elias is trying to save Jacob from an elevator fall, but do not climb up, because you need to destroy that bloodworm before you trigger the checkpoint. Bloodworms on this game are basically traps, so they're enemies that serve a trap function. They can't move or anything. They are basically set placements within the world that if you go near, they have so much range, and they will grab you at a distance, and then you have to do a QTE, but of course with auto QTE, Jacob just immediately kills it, but while incurring a little bit of damage. But for the purposes of this walkthrough, I am not going to take any damage from the bloodworms, especially since you can memorize their spawns easily. But whenever you shoot these pods that the bloodworms emerge from, there's always a sound effect that plays, so that's how you know that's a bloodworm. And also there's a bit of pulsating within the pod that allows you to understand if there's a bloodworm within it. And, you know, I'm saying a lot about these bloodworms, but, you know, memorize their spawns and you'll be fine. But we have a couple more encounters with the enemies. Oh, and this right here, I just tore off that guy's arm. So whenever the enemies on this game have only one arm, they will only ever do one attack. They cannot do 2 or 3 hit combos when they have one of their limbs dismembered. So that is very important to note, and it is something that can be very beneficial to you. That being said, there's no control over which limb you want to prioritize in the melee combat. And I think that's a huge missed potential on the game. I feel like the melee combat on this game could have had a bit more creativity with how you target certain limbs, especially since this is coming from a developer that made a name for itself by encouraging strategic limb dismemberment. And strategic limb dismemberment was a pretty novel concept at the time Dead Space 1 released. You know, like the whole ability to destroy limbs, and that is how you deal with the enemies. Like, they could have made a strategic limb discernment system specific to the melee for this game, but they didn't. All you're doing is just pressing R2, and you're just hoping that one of the arms breaks off so that you can then have more liberties with actually meleeing the enemy after you dodge one attack. But for the most part, you'll just be dodging 2 or 3 hit combos, and then randomly the enemy's arm will break off, and that will then allow you to then deal with them with increased liberties at your disposal. And you know, it just feels like lost potential. I'm pretty disappointed in that, but for the most part, when you're not thinking about it and you're actually playing the game, you know, the melee can be pretty engaging at times, aside from the parts where you're dealing with multiple enemies at once. And this sequence right here, this is a really fun combat encounter. So there is an environmental hazard introduced to you right here. So there are spikes on the wall, and really we were already introduced to spikes earlier on, but you can use the grip to launch enemies into spikes and instantly kill them. And this is beneficial for this sequence because you do not want to engage in melee combat with the enemies when there are multiple of them around. And, you know, like when you're actually positioning yourself correctly and you're launching the enemies immediately after grabbing them with the grip, that is what allows you to conserve a lot more of your energy in order to deal with the rest of the enemies, and it's so much fun. And this part right here I really like. So in the first playthrough, you're caught up in the moment, like, what the hell were the developers expecting me to do? And like, am I really going to be dealing with these enemies right there? And then you completely forget that you can grip them and actually pull them off the ledge. But in this case, there's actually a death barrier very close to the entranceway, which was the first time I've ever seen this, and I was shocked to see that that death barrier was there. And also, this combat sequence coming up, this is one of my favorite combat encounters in the game. There is a large amount of intelligence on the player's part required for this sequence, and there is a lot of fun and creativity given by the grip in this sequence. So there are gears in this room that you can use as environmental hazards against the enemies. And you don't have to launch the enemies with the grip. You can just strategically place yourself so that when you do grip the enemy, as they're being pulled towards you, they immediately hit these hazards. And that is what's allowing me to conserve a lot of energy. And you really only need about one battery for the sequence if you're doing it correctly. Oh, and also, you want to stand right around here so that you can influence the spawning of the enemies so that they're not spawning on the ground floor, and they're mainly spawning on the second floor above me. That way, they're going to be busy dropping down from the second floor in order to get over to you, and this gives you an opportunity to take advantage of their mantle animations and drop-down animations in order to actually use the grip on them. And that right there was very dangerous. I did not hear that guy. The enemies make almost no noise when they're running towards you, which is one of the things I do not understand. Although technically, Dead Space has never had any enemy sounds when they're running at you, so that can be pretty bullshit sometimes. And this game sadly has that problem. But this part of the area where you have these two mantle points and these two gears in the middle of the room, and I'm about to mantle over the left side right now after killing this guy. Always choose the mantle rather than going through the middle, because for some stupid reason the developers decided to make it where you can get damaged by the gears and get killed instantly if you go through the middle path. And you have no control over the movement of Jacob's arms, that he doesn't touch the gears or anything. And it's so narrow that it's so easy to actually get damaged and killed by these gears. And it's so fucking retarded. So you want to mainly mantle over these low pieces of cover rather than going through the middle. And that is what will allow you to ensure that you do not die and you deal with the enemies easily. And right now the sequence has ended, so go ahead and stomp the bodies in order to get their loot. I'm not a big fan of having to stomp the bodies. I've never liked it in Dead Space 2 and 3. I mean, I understand why it's there to make looting bodies more engaging, but really, it just feels like Occam's razor. Like, just having the enemy dead and dropping the loot is more than sufficient enough. I don't know why they have to put in the stomp system to just waste your time. I mean, I feel like it's there just to punish the player for not using the stomp to stomp the enemies, and they're basically being negligent towards this mechanic. But I think that's a really stupid excuse for this whole stomping system to actually get loot from the enemies. But that guy that I just killed with the melee, whenever the enemies have their legs dismembered and they're crawling on the ground, you can instantly kill them with the melee. And this is very important for the sequence entitled Lost, and also for Colony, because you're dealing with blind enemies, and the blind enemies are a really cool enemy type because you have the ability to dismember their leg with the riot gun in one shot, and they will instantly lose their leg. They will be floored to the ground and be forced to crawl, and then you can melee them and instantly kill them. And it's really powerful in that sequence, and it helps balance out the drill sequence in this game. But I'll talk about that when I get the chance, but you won't see it in this video because, like I said, this video covers the beginning all the way to the part where we get the suit. But it'll definitely be interesting to discuss when we actually get to that sequence. We just have a couple more stragglers left, more opportunities to use the grip to our advantage in order to kill the enemies. And we just skipped that really lengthy elevator ride, more of these unskippable moments involving vents and the like. And there's going to be some huge edits right here because this whole sequence is nothing but shimmying, and a couple of minor encounters with the enemies, and it really goes to show just how much the developers were out of their league when trying to import this game onto the last-gen consoles. And that right there was a bloodworm, so you gotta be careful of that. There are a couple of pods that look like bloodworm pods, but be careful of them. And then this right here, there are a bunch of these maggots, and they do very little damage against you, but what I'm going to do to try to minimize damage or potentially get no damage is I'm going to go back into the shimmy space and let the maggots group up near me so that I can then stomp them, but it doesn't work, and I don't think I managed to stomp any of them. I mean, I think maybe I stomped one, but the other enemies got me. So I missed that stomp right there, and then two of these maggots get me. And then there's another spawn of a maggot, but this one just initiates a grab that will not do any damage against you. And to be honest, though, I don't really understand how this grab animation works because sometimes they'll do the same jump animation towards you, but they won't grab you. They'll just explode on contact and deal damage to you. And I think it's dependent upon the angle you're facing in relation to the maggot, but I don't know. And I think this is as good a time as any to talk about the enemy diversity in this game. This game has a pretty pitiful amount of enemies. I am just disappointed that this game doesn't have anywhere near the same level of enemy variety that Dead Space 2 provided. I mean, Dead Space 1 also had a pretty interesting arrangement of enemies, just a huge amount of enemy diversity. And then Dead Space 2 one-upped Dead Space 1, and Dead Space 3 didn't really have any new additions, I would say. Just a couple of reskins of enemies you already encountered in Dead Space 2. But this game has less enemy types compared to Dead Space 1 and Dead Space 2. And I think it just makes the gameplay stale at times, or just a little too repetitive. I mean, when I'm actually playing the game, I'm not really thinking so much about it, but I think it's a definite issue that a lot of players will come across when actually playing through this game, because, I mean, enemy diversity, I can understand when developers choose not to include so many enemies. I mean, look at Resident Evil 7. Resident Evil 7, rather than providing so many different enemy types that are pretty shit, just like in Resident Evil 6, they opted to make the enemy types that they had interesting and well-designed and really fun to fight. And that is what Resident Evil 7 provides with its enemies. But, you know, the Callisto Protocol, given the fact that it has the combat systems it has the dodge, it has the melee, I mean, then again, maybe the focus with the melee is what likely contributed to the lacking enemy diversity with this game. So that could be one explanation. But going back to what I was saying, you know, this game has some pretty expansive combat systems, or just combat systems that reek of lost potential, that most likely this would be complemented by an increased enemy diversity, but the game doesn't really elaborate on this much. And it's very funny I'm saying this about the enemy diversity, because I feel like it measures up to how simple the story is on this game. And if you see my blind playthrough, you will know just how much I hated the story of the Callisto Protocol. The story of the Callisto Protocol, it doesn't even feel like a story. Like, there are so many moments in this game where I'm just questioning what the whole story is. Like, we're just doing a bunch of misconstrued, just completely disconnected events that just feel like we're being strung up in a series of unfortunate events that just became the story. That there's no order, there's no flow to the story on this game, and it just leads you to question everything about it. And then at the end, the whole story is just a reskin of Oswald E. Spencer's plan from Resident Evil 1 Remake, where the whole biophage pathogen just leaked out of the lab and infected the colonists, and then, oh, we have this corporation now that's trying to weaponize the biophage pathogen, and it's just so like cookie cutter in its bullshit and in its storytelling, and it feels like the Callisto Protocol is just a game that exists. It just feels like the developers rely more upon nostalgia towards Resident Evil and Dead Space rather than allowing the Callisto Protocol to stand on its own two legs, and because of that, this game doesn't have much of a leg to stand on with regards to its story. And then with the characters on this game also feel so cookie cutter in their nonsense, and none of them feel intriguing at all. And you know, you have like Danny as a character who's just very boring, and there's no interesting relationship being played out between Jacob and Danny whatsoever. I mean, Elias is a semi-decent character. He's just that good guy that you really feel bad that he had to die at the end. But, you know, like, given the fact that we've already been going on so many, like, misadventures that are so disconnected to the main plot, it's kind of easy to forget about Elias. And to return to Danny, Danny is a pretty bad character in this game. Like I said, there is no interesting relationship, partnership, or camaraderie, or exchange of dialogue that's interesting between Jacob and Danny spends most of her time just yelling at Jacob, and she just says things, and just a bunch of unrelated things, and she gets emotional a lot of the times, and like that moment where she's inspecting that corpse, trying to connect with its memories, and then she attacks Jacob, it just looks so silly. And then at the same time, they're wanting you to connect with her out of nowhere when it's revealed that her sister was a victim of the outbreak that occurred on Europa when the biophage pathogen was released there. And I felt absolutely nothing when that happened. I mean, Danny is just so cookie cutter in her interpretation, and she feels so similar to other bad characters I've seen in games, and there's just nothing interesting about her character. She's, like I said, very cookie cutter, very simple in her designs, and it measures up to how simple the entire story is. And then Captain Ferris as a main antagonist, he is so silly in his interpretation, in the way he's presented in the game. It doesn't feel diegetic with the survival horror atmosphere that they're trying to go for with this game compared to Tideman from Dead Space 2 or with Dana from Dead Space 2. And he just says some very cringy dialogue. He's just the typical asshole that just eats an apple and he does assholish things and the like, and that's somehow meant to be intimidating. And even with the way he looks when the biophage inside of him is just amplifying his physical characteristics, the guy is so ripped and he just looks like he's on a bunch of steroids. And how is that meant to be intimidating in the slightest? And then, like, at the final boss fight, it's this whole, like, alpha omega thing. It's like a big dog fight, and it just, the way it's presented looks so fucking silly. It's so fucking cringe. I mean, every time Captain Ferris is on screen, I'm just like, what the fuck am I playing right now? Am I really playing a survival horror game where I'm meant to actually be intimidated by this? I'm meant to take this seriously? Like, is this really supposed to be a serious story in this Callisto Protocol universe? It feels more like a comedy, just something very fucking goofy. But it's trying to pass itself off as something so seriously. What is this, some kind of dark comedy? Like, what the fuck is this? And then with Warden Cole is barely on screen that I can't even assess him as a character. And I feel like he's only there as a means to an end to introduce this very overblown, over-the-top concept with the story out of the blue involving aliens and the commonality, which is this group that we're dealing with. And I think it's run by aliens because we literally see Cole talking to holograms of these weird alien life forms that have the weirdest faces ever. They look like the Skrulls from the Marvel universe. I mean, what the fuck were they trying to go for with that? They played the alien card because they knew this whole story that they set up in the Callisto Protocol was going nowhere, and they just ran out of ideas as to what to do for the fucking story in this game. And I think that pretty much sums up the Callisto Protocol story until there's something else that's worth discussing about the story in the later videos. But right now, we're fighting a mutated enemy, so from this point onward, when we deal enough physical trauma to the enemy, tentacles will emerge, and you have to destroy the tentacles to stop these enemies from mutating. And the mutated enemies by themselves aren't a problem, it's just they have so much life, and so it can really make the gameplay feel very tedious. But at least it's a damn sight better than the way the mutated enemies were in Dead Space 3. Remember those father enemies, like the guys with the ice picks? And how they just randomly mutated out of nowhere whenever you dismember their limbs, and the mutations provided just allowed them to ignore any flinch animations and just fire these stupid range projectiles at you and get so much more momentum on their attacks that the dodge was just useless. Yeah, the mutated enemies in Dead Space 3 were so badly designed, but the mutated enemies on this game are better designed. It's just such a shame that they have so much life, and it's just there to encourage you to shoot the tentacles. Shooting the tentacles, I thought originally it was a really shit mechanic until I realized that the hitboxes on the tentacles are wider than they appear, so you can pretty much melee the enemy and then use the auto-lock function when you aim to aim for their tentacles and just mash them down with bullets in order to destroy the tentacles, because the hitboxes on the tentacles actually extend to the enemy's back and to their sides as well. And using the hand cannon and the riot gun is very effective at destroying the tentacles. So the main thing you need to take away from this is the hitbox on the tentacles is wider than they appear. So don't be afraid to immediately start shooting those tentacles, even if your shots don't look like they're hitting the tentacles directly. And right here, we have our first encounter with the Rushers. I really do not like that name, Rushers. I much prefer the term Stalkers. But this enemy type is probably one of my favorite enemy types in the game, because it's an enemy type that dies very fast, and it really makes you understand the importance of the melee. Like, melee is the strongest tool that you have against this enemy, because they die in 5 hits from the normal melee attacks. If you have the heavy attack or any of the other melee upgrades, do not bother using them, because when you use the normal attack with R2 in order to melee these rushers, it will force them to immediately attack you the moment they recover from their animation. And so how this works is you launch them away, you then strafe to initiate the dodge, and then repeat the process. And they will die in 5 hits. It is very effective against these enemies. And for this sequence, there are 3 enemies. And just like the stalkers from Dead Space 2 and 3, if you stay still for long enough and let these stalkers set up in their positions, eventually they will have the urge to rush at you. And when the rushers rush at you, you can dodge their jump attack or their close range melee attack, and you will be able to initiate the process of melee looping them. Oh, I have to explain this sequence right now. This is a badly designed sequence. The controls are terrible and the camera is shit. But go right, left, and then hold left the entire time. And then right here, go right. And then you need to go left. Hold left the entire time when you're doing this. And then from here, you need to go all the way to the right and just keep holding right the entire time. Because there's an obstacle on the left-hand side that if you touch it, you will die instantly. It's not this part, it's the next obstacle coming up. So this part right here, if you are not all the way to the right, or if you are all the way to the left but not entirely on the left, you will get hit by that obstacle and die instantly. And then this part, I died. And they give so many checkpoints on this sequence because they know how shit this entire sequence is designed. They know how shit the controls are. They know how shit the camera is, in making it impossible to determine where you are in relation to the obstacles. And this right here, just follow the path, go right, then left, and then keep holding left, and keep holding left right over here, and that is the last obstacle you have to deal with, and we're just going to skip on ahead to this part. And that will be the end of this really bad sequence. This is on par with those hover sequences or like boost sequences in Dead Space 2 and 3, where you're having to navigate obstacles as you're flying. Only the controls for this are even more awkward compared to those sequences from Dead Space 2 and 3. And if you're playing on hardcore difficulty in Dead Space 2 or Dead Space 3, those sequences were notoriously bad in their implementation. But that right there was the mutation. So the last hit on your melee, or like the hit in general that just launches the enemy away, deals enough physical trauma that it will always expose the tentacle, as you'll see right here. So that last hit I did to launch the enemy back, it released the tentacle. So now I'm going to be able to use the auto-lock system, which is basically a system similar to Resident Evil 3 Remake, when you dodged in Resident Evil 3 Remake and you did your perfect dodge, that allows you to automatically lock onto the enemy when you deal the final hit on your melee. And you can just mash them down with bullets from the hand cannon or from the riot gun before they have a chance to mutate. And you have to do it fast. The speed at which these enemies mutate is absolutely absurd. At times it can feel like they mutate after a second, and that's why you've got to continuously stun them and just keep shooting those tentacles in order to stop them from mutating. And even if they do mutate, as long as you're dealing with one enemy that's mutated and there aren't any other enemies around, dealing with the mutated enemies is no hassle in the melee. It's just it takes forever to do with the melee. And now we've gotten to the dome, and this part right here, when you get inside the next building, do not go all the way inside, because you'll want to focus on getting rid of this robot, because this robot is a nuisance, and he can screw with the strategy you're going to be using to deal with the rushers that spawn in this dome area later on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sneak past him, wait for him to go all the way there so that I can at least stand up and walk towards the door, and then start sprinting. I'm going to use the third-person cover trick to my advantage and aim for his head. I think it takes about 8 hits to the head in order to take this guy out. I could be wrong. I mean, I think it's within the range of 7 to 10 hits or something to the head in order to take this guy out. And because I'm using the third-person cover trick, he's not going to be able to shoot me, and I can still shoot him. And he's been taken down. I just need to stomp his body, and then I can gain access to the decoder, and these sell for a lot. Not as much as the CPU printers that you can get from the twin-head monster or boss fight that you fight later on, and you fight way too much of that enemy type, but I'll talk more about that enemy type when I get to the next video. And now we're going to proceed onward to dealing with the enemies. You want to take the right path. The right path is the way you're supposed to go. There are a couple of optional areas in the Callisto protocol, but they aren't worth going for because they're never well designed and they have way too many enemies, and there is no incentive to go for the optional areas because of how much this game works at baseline. And, the loot you're getting, I mean, the only important loot is just the Callisto credits and just any ammunition you get from the enemies. And you can easily buy ammunition from the reforge stations. And with this game, I recommend you use the store because this game becomes really unbalanced later on. And the store is mandatory to ensure that this game works as intended. Feel free to slot into upgrades if you want. Feel free to buy a lot of ammunition because you're going to need it, because later on there's going to be a lot of damaged spongy bosses in the later areas, and that's why I purchased a lot of riot gun ammo when I gain access to the riot gun when Danny gives it to me. And this part right here, this rusher will never attack you. He's scripted to just run along the wall, and once you get inside of the vent, that rusher will never follow you. He will never even follow you through the vents, which is surprising. But this right here, as long as that robot's not in the way, you can easily use your grip to just drop these enemies into the abyss. So I'm just basically tapping X while aiming and then releasing the aim function so that I can just use up as little grip as possible. And then this sequence is very buggy as well, because even though I killed those enemies, sometimes one of the enemies I killed will just be magically back on this platform out of nowhere, and I have bloopers of this saved that I'm reserving for my poor designs of the Callisto Protocol series that I'll be doing. So this is why I'm waiting and just biding my time for as long as I am waiting right now, because I'm trying to ensure that I don't get screwed by this bug with the rushers in the sequence. But now that I've triggered the next spawn, dealing with the rushers is going to be easy. Just like the stalkers from Dead Space 2 and 3, the rushers will only attack one at a time. The next one will attack you as soon as you've killed the one that you're dealing with. And again, it's going to be a waiting process when dealing with these rushers one at a time, because eventually they will come after you if you just wait long enough, just like with the stalkers from Dead Space 2 and 3. And in this sequence, the rushers have the ability to actually climb on the trees and just bounce from tree to tree in order to get to you. And it just makes it a lot faster for this sequence, which is really good. So you saw that second rusher and how he wasn't attacking me. That's because I'm dealing with this guy right now. This is an important design. This is why these sequences with the rushers work as intended, because they don't allow the clunkiness and broken designs with the combat on this game to show itself, because they're just encountering you one at a time. And I think there's about 4 of these rushers in the sequence, maybe 5 of them. I haven't really been keeping count. But I'm just waiting, and there's that rusher right there, but this guy right here is the one that's in the trees, and he's coming towards me, so I'm just going to deal with him. And you see the blue reticle, that is the auto-lock system, just like the auto-aim feature in Resident Evil 3 Remake. When you successfully dodge an enemy, and then Jill just automatically locks on to an enemy when she aims her gun, or she just does a quick stab. And one thing that I really like about the auto-lock system in the Callisto Protocol is that when you shoot the enemy, when you use the auto-lock function, it is a guaranteed stun on them. And this is very advantageous when you are trying to destroy the tentacles, because the thing with the enemies on this game is that they get a lot of hyper armor if you're not specifically hitting them after they've done their combo. If you try hitting them during their combo, they just hyper armor through your attacks. And when you're using the hand cannon, the first shot will stun the enemy, but if you just continue shooting them, they eventually just hyper armor through the remaining shots. It's so stupid in this game, but I understand why, but I just wish it wasn't so egregious like it is. When you're using the riot gun, it is a guaranteed stun on them, although sometimes when the enemies go into the startup frames of their melee animation, they will ignore the stuns generated by the riot gun. And I noticed this a lot of times whenever I was dealing with the blind enemies and they initiated the startup frames of their animation. So the main thing you'll want to take away from this is that whenever you are trying to melee an enemy, you must only melee them whenever they've done their combo. The only exception to this is with Captain Ferris, because Captain Ferris does not have the ability to hyper armor through any of your hits, even if you hit him while he's in the middle of attacking. And when you're using the guns, you should only ever be using the guns whenever you are dealing with tentacles and you're just trying to destroy those tentacles, because it's a quick kill on the enemy. Or when you're using the riot gun, you can just launch the enemy away and just repeatedly stunlock them unless they go into the startup frames of the melee animation that they do. Or if they're in the middle of transforming, because sometimes when you're dealing with the normal enemies, when they're transforming, they don't flinch. This is not really the case with the blind enemies, but I'll discuss more about this later on in the next video. This is the end of this part of the walkthrough. Stay tuned for the future parts. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.